What is going on, friends? This is Matt Carter, your local realtor in London, Ontario, and today I'm going to be coming at you with an answer to an interesting question that sometimes I get asked, but I know is on a lot of people's minds, especially if they're new to the real estate market, buying their first home or even selling their first home and going into something else. And that is, how can I get out of a contract or an agreement of purchase and sale if I've already accepted it and signed it? For this, the answer to this question, we're gonna have to start back at the basics a little bit to catch everybody up if you don't know exactly how the whole buying process works. So for 99+% of the time that you are buying a home in the province of Ontario, if you're going through an agent that's listed a home on Realtor.ca through the MLS, what you're going to be doing is putting in an offer through standardized forms that have been developed through OREA, or the Ontario Real Estate Association. As realtors, we have access to all these forms through our software and our backend, and we provide all this documentation so you can successfully put a bid in on a home and hopefully get that home to call your own. 95% of that document is pre-worded, it's already been done up, and it is put in place in order to protect both the seller and the buyer in certain aspects, as well as to outline the realtor's job in the whole process, and to make sure that down the road, if there are any issues, everything that you could pretty much think of is in writing and everybody's agreeing to the same terms. There are, however, some areas of those forms that you can change, you and your realtor can change in terms of, asking or offer price, your deposit, and a couple other options. And I've outlined all of those documents necessary for purchasing a home in a prior video. So if you're not familiar with them, go take a look at my previous video to take a look at that in more detail. With every offer that you submit through the normal processes that we use, there's what's called an irrevocable period. And basically what that means is when you submit an offer, you create a time period in which that offer is valid until. As soon as that time and date has passed, the offer that you've submitted is no longer valid. And if you were still interested in the property and maybe the seller had something come up, they just didn't get to it, you would have to rewrite your offer and change that irrevocable period to sometime in the future in order for them to then deal with that offer again. That brings us to point number one. Once you have submitted that offer with your irrevocable period, that essentially means it is irrevocable. You cannot take it back until that period of time has come to pass, and then you can change your offer. So that's why it's always important to speak with your realtor and get some informed decisions. So when you are offering on a property, as soon as you've submitted it, you're not thinking to yourself, man, I wish I had offered X amount dollars more or X amount dollars less or added this or that. Make sure that you have all that down pat before you send your offer away, because you cannot take it back, and that seller has the opportunity to accept, reject, or counter offer that paperwork. So let's say that everything is good with that paperwork and the sellers loved your offer, they've accepted it. What comes next is now that you have 24 hours or 1 business day in order to submit an earnest money deposit. And basically what this means is you have 24 hours to get a certain amount of money, which is outlined in the offer, to the listing brokerage, that's generally who holds the deposit. And what you'll have to do is get that to them, and what it does is basically shows your commitment to purchasing that property. Because as we'll see when I talk about it in a little bit, if you were to back out of the deal and for not a valid reason, you wouldn't get that money back and the sellers would get to keep it. So sometimes within that 24-hour period, some things can happen on either the buyer or seller side. And let's say as a buyer, you don't get that deposit into the seller. The seller now has the option, although they have a signed contract with you, they do have an option to go and look at other offers that maybe were submitted on the same day as you offered, or they can relist their property. Because that 24 hours have passed, they're not obligated to give you front running for that property anymore, and they can move on to the next party. A lot of times this is a little bit of a gray area, and some people do allow for more than that 24 hours because generally speaking, if you are getting your deposit in, your offer was better than any other offer that came in on the same day, so the seller will most likely still want to work with your offer. So another thing that can come up, if you had submitted an offer and had some contingencies or conditions in the offer and it was accepted, you'll have a given amount of time, which is again specified in the offer, to complete those conditions. Some common ones are your financing condition as well as an inspection. Those are by far the two most common conditions that we do see in offers. So let's say that you've given or that they have requested 3 or 5 days in order to get those conditions looked after. So if it's an inspection, they're going to have an inspector come through. If it's financing, they're going to go have a talk with their bank or their lender to make sure that they're going to get their money. Within those 3 to 5 days, whichever specified in the offer, once that time limit has come to an end, the buyer or yourself would have to submit a form saying that those conditions have either been fulfilled or they haven't. If they haven't been fulfilled, such as you found something during the inspection that wasn't up to your standards and you didn't want to deal with, or your financing didn't come through, then you would say those conditions did not come through, and then you no longer have to firm up the offer and go forward with the next processes of taking possession of that home. Or if everything was good with those conditions, you can submit a form saying that those conditions were fulfilled, and your offer then becomes a firm offer, and all the next steps in the process start happening with your lawyers and your bank to get the house ready for closing whenever you have specified in your offer. So those are a couple different ways that you can essentially get out of a deal if you've already have signed paperwork within the first week or so of having that paperwork signed. Now, these reasons need to be valid, and you can't just be making up excuses in order to get out of a deal, because there could be potential litigation there down the road. So always make sure that if you are backing out of a deal for, unfulfilling the conditions, that you actually have legitimate reasons to do so, and then that the sellers can't come back at you and have any sort of litigation towards you. Another interesting one is if you're purchasing a new build condo in the province of Ontario, there's what's called a cooling off period. So it's a 10-day cooling off period in which after you have signed an agreement of purchase and sale, you can decide to renege that agreement and get out of it during those 10 days. So those are all legitimate ways you can get out of an agreement of purchase and sale in Ontario. And just make sure if you are going to do it that you're taking good advice from both your realtor and your lawyer that you're using for your real estate transaction to make sure that you're doing it properly, and then there's no way that the seller can come back at you and sue you for any wrongful damages or any other sort of litigation. But let's take a little bit of a different approach. Let's say your closing day is coming up and you've submitted a deposit amount of $10,000. You know that's already sunk into the deal, and something comes up and you really just don't want to close on that property anymore. You say, hey, maybe I'll just take the hit of $10,000, as much as that sucks, but it's better than whatever situation we're in right now, and we'll eat the $10,000 and move on. This is one thing you really want to be careful of, because this is where you open yourself up to a whole whack of possible litigation by the sellers. And I think the best way to go about explaining this is actually to provide a real life example that happened in 2017 in Toronto. On March 20th, 2017, a buyer purchased a property. The buyer was also a realtor, funny enough. Purchased a property for just over $1.15 million and put a deposit of $50,000 on that property. The house was set to close roughly 5 months later, and as the closing date came up, the buyer decided that he was not going to close on the property. He went and spoke with his lawyer, and they came up with a big list of reasons why they weren't able to close on the property. I don't have the specifics of the list, but largely they were seen as they were just fabricated, unquantifiable reasons why this buyer could not close on the property. About a week and a half later, the sellers put their property up for sale again, and because of the large difference in time between the original sale and when they put it up again, the market had shifted quite dramatically. And they actually received an offer on their property and a sale of it for $235,000 less than the original offer that the buyer made. 2 months later, the sellers, obviously being quite upset that they got so much less money for their home, went through their lawyer and ultimately tried to settle with the original buyer that backed out of the deal with $230,000 of a settlement for the lost sale price of the home. But the buyer refused the settlement and decided to take them to court to see what the court had to say about it. So 2.5 years later, after the dust had settled from the lawsuit, the sellers were awarded $253,000, just north of that, in damages from the original buyer who backed out of the deal. Now, it didn't stop here. The buyer went back and tried to appeal the decision, and throughout the entire process that took over a year, it actually just finished up in March 2021 this year, the buyer then had to pay an additional cost. At the end of the day, the sellers were out roughly $2,600, and the buyer was out a whopping $458,000. Needless to say, the buyer would have been much better off, first of all, closing on the property, if not that, taking the settlement that the sellers originally offered, and even prior to that, getting some better legal advice for what to do in their particular situation. So I know this is over $1 million property, and this is not a case that's going to happen all the time, but this just goes to show you the possible damages and the possible headaches you can get by making poor decisions and not planning through the entire process. Make sure before you even put an offer in on a property that you are fully financially stable and you understand the whole process of buying a home. In the end, if you are thinking about backing out of a contract, make sure that you talk to some good get some good legal advice before doing anything, and make sure that you don't put yourself in a situation which you may regret down the line. That about wraps it up. Hopefully this gave you a little bit of insight as to whether or not you can back out of a deal, once you've already got into it, and some of the possible ramifications. If you like this content, make sure you hit that like button, comment below, hit the subscribe button, and also make sure you turn on notifications so that you get informed whenever I release a video in the future. Until next time, take care.